Picture the scene. You are a mechanic in 1971. Someone rolls a Rover 3500 into your bay on a Tuesday morning and asks you to change the rear brake pads. Simple job. 20 minutes, maybe 30 with a cup of tea in the middle. You slide under the car and stop. Because the rear brake calipers are not out at the wheels where every other car in Britain puts them. They are buried inboard, pressed tight against the differential housing deep in the undercarriage. Reaching them requires removing the drive shafts. 4 hours later, you are still under there. Your knuckles are bleeding. You have said words your mother would not forgive. And somewhere in Solihull, the engineer who designed this is at his desk, absolutely convinced he made the right call. That engineer was not wrong. That is the part of this story that is almost impossible to explain. The Rover P6 was not complex because the men who built it were incompetent. It was complex because they were obsessively, pathologically committed to doing every single thing the right way. Every component was engineered to a standard so far beyond what a 2-liter family saloon needed that mechanics wept. And accountants, when they finally understood what they were looking at, went very pale and very quiet. This is the story of the most over-engineered car Britain ever put into mass production. A car built from a brief that made no rational sense. Assembled around principles that had no precedent in the family saloon market and finished to a standard that made it almost impossible to build at a profit. A car that beat Mercedes at the very first European Car of the Year. A car that British police trusted to hold 100 miles an hour all day, and a car that a dying conglomerate then managed to build so catastrophically badly it was named the worst new car in England. Same bones, different world. It starts with an idea that was completely correct and about 15 years too early. In 1950, Rover drove the world's first gas turbine car down a road in Warwickshire. A turbine spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions. No pistons, no conventional gearbox, a jet like wine where an engine note should be. The board watched it go and made a decision that shaped the next 20 years of the company. The gas turbine was the future. They were going to be ready for it. And when the mid-1950s came and the company needed a new saloon, the chairman handed 2 engineers a brief that was equal parts visionary and completely mad. Design the most advanced car Britain has ever built. Design it around a gas turbine that does not yet exist in a road-ready form. And design it well enough that when the turbine arrives, it drops straight in. Those 2 engineers were Spen King and Gordon Bashford. King was the sort of man who would rather spend 6 months finding the right solution than 6 days finding a good enough one. Bashford turned King's thinking into structures that could actually be built. Between them, they would produce a car so technically extraordinary that engineers still stop and stare at its component drawings. They would also, by accident, produce a car that was nearly impossible to assemble and absolutely ruinous to manufacture at scale. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The first thing you need to understand is what King did to the front suspension. Every other British car put its springs vertically in towers inside the engine bay. Obvious. Springs go up. King laid the front springs almost completely flat, running rearward through bell cranks and bearing their load against the bulkhead itself. Not angled. Nearly horizontal. The engine bay was left open and wide, ready for a turbine that had not yet arrived. The towers were gone. The space was clear. The consequence nobody planned for was safety. With nothing standing directly behind the engine, a heavy frontal impact would drive the powertrain downward and under the cabin floor rather than backward into the driver's legs. King had been clearing space for a turbine. He had accidentally designed one of the most advanced crash protection geometries in the world. In the year other British saloons were still pointing solid steering columns at drivers' sternums, the P6 was routing its engine below the floor in an accident. Then there was the back of the car. The rear axle was a de Dion arrangement. You would normally find this on a racing car or a very expensive hand-built machine. The heavy mechanical components, the differential, the final drive, were mounted fixed to the body rather than hanging off the axle. Less unsprung weight, better wheel control and cornering. More grip. For a 2-liter car aimed at solicitors, it was comically excessive. King did not care. If he was going to build the bones, he was going to build them properly. And the brakes. Instead of mounting the rear calipers out at the wheels, King placed them inboard, clamped against the differential casing at the center of the car. His reasoning was sound. Inboard brakes reduce unsprung weight. The ride is better. The handling is sharper. The physics genuinely work. The mechanic who needs to reach them will require the dexterity of a surgeon, but the engineer was not dwelling on that part. Around all of it, Rover invented what they called base unit construction. The structural skeleton of the car was a completely self-contained, welded unit. The outer panels, the wings, the doors, the bonnet, the roof, none of them carried structural load. They bolted onto the skeleton, and that was all. You could unbolt every panel from a P6 and drive the bare skeleton away. The bones were complete in themselves. The skin was just clothing. Rover sold this as easier to repair after a knock, and they were right. A damaged wing could be unbolted and swapped in an afternoon. What nobody had quite understood was that those bolt-on panels created sealed cavities where moisture collected, invisible, unreachable, quietly dissolving the steel from the inside out while the car looked perfect from 20 feet. The safety specification in 1963 was science fiction for a family saloon. Crumple zones, front and rear, engineered and crash-tested. A collapsible steering column. An impact-absorbing dashboard with deformable honeycomb structure across the knee line. 3-point inertia reel belts for all 4 occupants. Anti-burst door locks. Rover had thought through what happened when this car hit something and designed for every part of it. The car arrived at Earl's Court in October 1963. And in 1964, in the very first European Car of the Year competition ever held, the Rover 2000 took the prize with 76 points. The runner-up was the Mercedes-Benz 600, the limousine of heads of state. Third was the Hillman Imp, a car from Solihull built around an engine that had not been designed for it, with suspension borrowed from racing and brakes that baffled every mechanic in the country, had just beaten Mercedes in front of all of Europe in the award's inaugural year. If you grew up in Britain in the 1960s or 1970s and your father or your uncle drove one of these, I want to know. The smell of the interior. Whether it was the 4-cylinder or the V8, whether it sat outside a suburban house or carried a police radio in the back. The stories from people who were actually there are the reason this channel exists. Subscribe before you leave this video because those comments are worth more than anything I can write up here. January 1964. Rover's managing director, William Martin Hurst, is in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, at the Kiefer Mercury Marine Works. He is there to sell Rover engines to Americans. He does not sell anything. What he finds instead, sitting shelved and forgotten in a workshop corner, is an all-aluminum V8 that General Motors had designed for its smaller American cars and then abandoned after 3 years because building engines from aluminum at that scale cost more than the market would bear. GM had walked away from it, considered it a dead end. Hurst looked at it with the eye of a man who had been staring at Rover's own 4-cylinder for months. The dimensions stopped him. The Buick 215 aluminum V8 was within half an inch of the Rover 4 in length and only 12 pounds heavier. A V8, abandoned in a Wisconsin boatyard, was almost exactly the same size as the 4-cylinder sitting in the most over-engineered saloon in Britain. He had it crated and shipped to Solihull. Spen King objected immediately. He had not built the P6 for a V8. The gearbox was wrong. The driveline was not designed for this torque. He was right about all of it. Hurst did it anyway. The car that emerged, the Rover 3500, was by some considerable distance the finest car Rover ever made. The de Dion axle, that had been excessive for a four-cylinder, now managed a V8 with a composure that felt almost contemptuous. The inboard brakes that infuriated every mechanic in Britain were stopping one of the fastest saloons on the road with fade-free authority. The chassis, overbuilt for a gas turbine that never came, had finally met an engine that understood what it was. British police noticed immediately. The 3500 became the motorway patrol car of choice. It could sit at a genuine 100 miles an hour all day without drama, composed through bends in a way that embarrassed heavier machines, stopping reliably when the de Dion geometry kept both rear wheels planted and square. One Hampshire constabulary example served continuously for 14 years, not because anyone could not afford a replacement, because the thing simply would not stop being good. For a few years in the early 1970s, this was the reality. A small company in Solihull building one of the genuinely great cars in Europe. Complex beyond all reason. A mechanic's nightmare, but fundamentally right in a way that only happens when engineers are trusted to solve problems properly rather than cheaply. Then British Leyland inherited it. By 1968, Rover had been absorbed into the vast, struggling conglomerate that would come to define everything that went wrong with British manufacturing. Strikes ate the calendar. Cash ran dry. The tooling that had been imperfect at launch was never replaced. The de Dion axle that required setting up by the feel of a fitter who had done it 1,000 times was now being assembled on a line that had been stopped and restarted so many times that the institutional knowledge had walked out the door with the men who held it. In November 1975, 1,000 workers walked out and P6 production stopped dead. The engineering that had made the car exceptional made its degradation irreversible, because you cannot half-assemble a de Dion axle. You cannot adequately torque an inboard brake caliper on worn tooling in a plant that is on its 4th strike of the year. In August 1975, Drive magazine named the Rover 3500 the worst new car in England. The car they reviewed had been bought new in 1974. In its first 6 months, it consumed 3 engines, 2 gearboxes, 2 clutch assemblies, and required a complete wiring loom replacement. It spent 114 of its first 165 days in a workshop. Not a neglected car. A car built with catastrophic indifference on worn-out tooling by a workforce inside a company that had no money and no will to make anything better. Spenking's design had not failed. Everything around it had. The last P6 was built on the 19th of March, 1977. Roughly 322,000 had left Solihull across 14 years. The replacement, the SD1, arrived in 1976. No de Dion. No inboard brakes. Conventional springs standing upright as God and Ford intended. Engineered deliberately to be cheaper and simpler to build. In 1977, it won European Car of the Year, the same prize the P6 had taken 13 years earlier. The original and its budget replacement with the same trophy. The accountants called it a vindication. The engineers called it a verdict. Here is what stays with me. The complexity of the P6 was never indulgence, and it was never showing off. It came from a decision made in the 1950s to build a car worthy of an engine the company believed was coming, and to build it so completely that, when that engine arrived, nothing would need changing. The turbine never came. What came instead was an abandoned American V8, found by accident in a Wisconsin workshop by a man who had gone there to sell something else entirely. And the only car in Britain ready to receive it was the one that had been overbuilt for a future that never arrived. The panels rusted, the tooling wore out, the institution collapsed, but the de Dion tube that King specified for a gas turbine that existed only in his chairman's faith is still out there in scrapyards and restorations, in garages where someone with bleeding knuckles is trying to set up the inboard calipers by feel. Still holding. Still refusing to be ordinary. If you had one of these, or you rode in the back of a father's or an uncle's, or you watched a white 3500 sail past on the motorway once and never quite forgot it, tell me in the comments what it was really like. The people who were there keep these stories alive. Subscribe before you go. The cars the history books ignore are the ones worth remembering most.